Okay, we're going to begin with a short family history. I want to give you some background. Grandpa was really unique in that he, when he met somebody and talked to them, he was so humble. Our family in Japan came from many, many years of religious virtue. There's always been a monk in the family, a Buddhist monk, and we have one even today. And he was raised under those Buddhist principles. And when he met my grandmother from Florida, he switched over to Catholicism because she was Catholic, so he had the best of two worlds there. And he would disarm you as soon as you started talking to him, and that's how he got a lot of this stuff accomplished. And he worked with incredible history-making gentlemen in the Navy. He worked for Admiral Hannibal H. Christie, who got his ship shot out from him in World War I. And Admiral Christie was a brilliant, intelligent man. He got all of the sailors off that big cruiser, except for one who was probably injured during the torpedo blast. And as Admiral Christie was on the hull of the ship looking for other sailors, they said, "That's it, Admiral," and he jumps in the ocean as the ship went belly up. And the guys out there just broke up and applauded him as he jumped off the ship. He worked for Captain Henry Mustin. Henry Mustin was a legendary figure who actually flew the first airplane off by catapult before the big bird farms were, the big carriers were launching aircraft. He flied the first one, so he's an aviation pioneer. He worked for another gentleman that actually designed the tunnel in San Francisco. So he worked with all these great men, and they loved him. He was so popular, he was a great cook. My little nephew always says, "Grandpa cooked his way out of the camps." Pretty much so. And he was a specialist in pastries, so he fed their tummies and their sweet tooths. They loved him. Okay, well, here we go, because I could go on and on and on. Kinji Inomata, is that Grandpa up there? Okay, that's him as a young man. I don't think that was in Japan, because that uniform looks more like one of those professional Navy steward uniforms for the big parties. But it could be, I don't think so though. So my grandfather Kenji Inomata was born in Niigata, Japan in 1885 to a noble family of big business, a long history of religious virtue, and samurai nobility also. Now, only aristocratic families had a family crest known as a kamon. Except for me, I'm not too aristocratic. The family was very wealthy in Japan. They manufactured kimono cloth, and they shipped it all around the islands. And the shipping concern, my uncle, great uncle, was an executive there. So he was a whiz on the soroban. A soroban is a Japanese abacus. He was like a lightning calculator, and he was very good on the docks. He loved ships. He loved the sea, and stowed away one day on a British steamship with the permission of the captain. The captain wanted to learn Japanese, and Grandpa wished to learn English, and he took off and never went back. It's amazing. He was probably about 16 or 17. However, my father told me he was 11 years old. I find that a little hard to believe. He could have been a cabin boy at 11 years old, but I kind of doubt it. Okay, after sailing to Europe and countries, he jumped ship while in New York Harbor and worked in greasy spoon restaurants in the shipyard district until 1906. He then enlisted in the U.S. Navy as a steward. The Navy did not ask to see any papers, nor did they care. They needed stewards. 5 battleships later that he served on, he was assigned to shore duty at the Pensacola Naval Air Station in Florida, where he served under the station commandants, war heroes, and aviation pioneers. He also reported to 70 other high-ranking officers who gave him first-rate appraisals. An excellent cook and a pastry specialist, he was also on many officers' waiting lists for his services. They really liked that guy. In 1919, he became a naturalized American citizen against all legal authority. There was not one statute, legal case on the books that permitted a Japanese person to become a United States citizen. Now the judge was very, very liberal, William Boswick Shepherd. He even took on the Ku Klux Klan in Florida. Now that's a pretty big thing back in 1919. So he heard that the federal court of Hawaii was inclined to naturalize 398 Japanese from World War I because of a provision. Well, they naturalized all 398, and the Supreme Court struck it down. Amazing. Well, William Shepherd, the judge in my grandpa's case, he came out of his chambers and he says, well, you know, the Hawaiian federal court's going to naturalize 398 Japanese veterans, so I'm going to do him. So he naturalized Grandpa, and Grandpa became a citizen. And the Florida newspaper didn't have anything really good to say about it.
Hold on. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was standard to use a three-letter word back in those days, you know. And there were a host of others. Now, I'm going to be using that, but in context here today, so you'll have to excuse me. Now, in 1928, well, by the way, the Navy sent 2 naval officers to court with him to make sure that he was naturalized, and he was. So in 1928, he moved his family to Los Angeles to get away from the rank prejudice of the KKK, who openly marched in the streets of Florida. And in spite of the California anti-alien laws prohibiting Japanese from purchasing property, he purchased a home in Los Angeles and raised his family of 6. Grandpa broke all the rules. I got to tell you, I researched this matter for 20 years, and it never ceases to amaze me, the stuff that he did. And I'll give you a theory as to why I think that happened later. Okay, now we get to Executive Order 9066 and its prejudicial enforcement. After Pearl Harbor on February 19, 1942, FDR signs Executive Order 9066, which authorized the War Department to designate military areas from which persons deemed a threat to national security could be removed. Now, Army Provost Marshal General Alan Guillon, the United States and Army's highest-ranking law enforcement officer, therefore recommended, and this is how it happened, recommended a roundup of all alien and citizen Japanese because, get this, some representative from the LA Chamber of Commerce recommended it. Yeah, that's really authoritative. Now, in order to declare areas on the West Coast to be military areas, which they were not. We were not under attack on the West Coast. General George Marshall, he was a real trickster. He falsely declared the Pacific Coast as a theater of operations, which transformed it into a war zone, which gave them the authority to imprison the Japanese. Okay, now because Japanese blood is considered pathogenic, Grandpa and Dad are fired from their once secure civil service jobs. All you had to have was 1/16 Japanese, actually any traceable degree of Japanese ancestry, and you were a goner. So in March 1942, evacuation had officially begun. Grandpa, an honorably discharged 30-year Navy veteran, and 12 other Japanese employees of the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power met with the intolerant Los Angeles Mayor Fletcher Boron. Boron relied on a story by radio broadcaster Drew Pearson alleging that one Patrick Okura, a Los Angeles city official working at the Department of Water and Power, was overseeing a force of 50 Japanese spies who planned to sabotage the city's water and power system. It was totally fiction. It was also alleged that Okura, now this is interesting, was guilty of parading as an Irishman by placing an apostrophe between the O and K of his last name. Isn't that a laugh? It didn't do anything to put the Japanese in camp. At that meeting, and you'll love this, Boron suggested to the 13 employees, and they assented, to voluntarily request a long-term leave of absence. Well, that was cutting your throat, because after several months, you'd be terminated and you would lose your retirement. So that's what happened to Grandpa and other people. Actually, one other guy of notoriety was in that group, but I'll get to that later. My father worked at McClellan Army Air Force Base in Sacramento, California as a junior airplane mechanic. And he loved his job because he had went to school and studied engineering, blueprints, electrical wiring. He wanted to become a pilot and a mechanic, airplane mechanic. He'd taken flying lessons. It was his ideal job. He wanted to become a pilot. He talked to all the pilots at Pensacola Naval Air Station, and they just inspired him to take up that objective. So he, sitting down, he overhears a broadcast about Pearl Harbor over the radio, and also an announcement that, quote, all Japanese employees are suspended and are not to return to McClellan Airfield. McClellan was Dad's dream job and a means of becoming an airplane mechanic and a pilot. He was upset and he went to the base anyways. Dad was very stubborn. He was a real firebrand, a muckraker. He didn't like being messed with. The FBI had jurisdiction, and he talked to an agent after almost getting into a fight when he walked in there, and he was looking for a line to get in, a line for Filipinos, Koreans, Chinese, a lot of the nieces. And the guard walks up to him and says, so can I help you, son? What line are you looking for? I was looking for the Japanese. He could have heard a pin drop. So anyways, he takes him into the office. And he argued that if he were truly a threat to national security, he had an opportunity to sabotage the B-17 bombers he serviced on December 7th of 1941. You know, why would you let a guy service the aircraft if you thought he was a spy or something? The agent became convinced of Dad's loyalty, and I'll get this, this is a real accomplishment. J. Edgar Hoover, who was of the opinion that the West Coast Japanese hysteria was a bunch of gossip. That was his viewpoint. He approved the issuance of a return to work pass to Dad. That's pretty crazy.
It's your sister Sandra. Do we want to have J. Edgar Hoover?
We want J. Edgar. So J. Edgar took a lot of heat on the things that he did, but we appreciate that he gave Dad a working pass to report back to McClellan Airfield. Now this was quite an accomplishment for a 20-year-old young man. He was intelligent and was a member of the prestigious Japanese study club in high school. However, when the FBI lost jurisdiction of the base captain contacted the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, and had him fire Dad on a trumped-up charge that Dad failed to pass probation. Now that was nonsense. He wouldn't have serviced those B-17 bombers. He didn't pass probation. So Dad was told to go home to his family because he and his family were going to be rounded up and put in some camp. That was the first they heard of actually this camp business coming down. Stimson also disliked the Japanese and said of them, their racial characteristics are such that we cannot understand or trust even the citizen Japanese. Okay, now we're ready. We're going to pursue some exemption. The War Relocation Authority had prepared cards earmarking us for incarceration. And my entire family, including the non-Japanese wives, expecting a baby from the men in our family, were ordered in prison because they were carrying a Japanese baby. Now, Japanese blood was considered, again, pathogenic by the Army, much like the Germans considered Jewish blood diseased. Now, after the child would be born in the detention camp, the mother could leave the camp, but her enemy alien baby would have to remain in custody in an orphanage, such as a Manzanar children's village. Yeah. Extreme, yes. But that was the hatred of the Japanese by the populace. Even Roosevelt claimed the Japanese were hostile based on the contour of their skull, something he picked up from phrenology, a pseudoscience involving the measurement of bumps on the skull to predict mental traits. What? Okay, prior to being evacuated, the WRA, War Relocation Authority, learned of Grandpa's 30-year service in the Navy, the many warships he served on, including his service at the Pensacola Naval Air Station. Many of the high-ranking officers wrote letters to the commanding general, as well as the United States Attorney, attesting to Grandpa's loyalty. Now remember, he worked with some heavyweights. He even worked, as I mentioned earlier, for Admiral Christie, who was a member of the Naval Board. You got to listen to him if he talks. He even served under Admiral, who became a member of the General Navy Board. He was even an acquaintance of the Duchess of Windsor, and you'll see a picture out on the table out there, where he had met Wally Wallace Simpson when she was married to a naval officer, and they were chummy buddies. He even had a framed picture of her on his desk. That's out there. Now, the War Relocation Authority took the first step towards a possible exemption and told Grandpa and his family to hold off from evacuation until they could further review his case. Here we have the first challenge of the possibility of taming prejudice and maybe defeating Executive Order 9066. Or was it just a pipe dream? Who knows? As we waited to hear from the War Relocation Authority about remaining behind, we further learned that the United States Attorney William Fleet Palmer, who had been interrogating Japanese, German, and Italian enemy aliens for loyalty since December of 1941. Now, General DeWitt, on the other hand, refused to screen the Japanese, claiming, he uses a biblical phrase, there was no time to separate the sheep from the goats. I'll tell you more about General DeWitt coming up. Well, that's what the screening process is for. So the family went to the Department of Justice building in downtown LA to apply for exemption. This was a big thing. Department of Justice screening people from camp. So when my diverse and colorful family showed up at the Department of Justice, a staff member remarked, "Wow, your family looks like the League of Nations." And they did, because we're all what Hawaiians call chop suey mix. We have everything. Mutts. Grandpa was interviewed and asked questions like, well, who do you want to win the war? Do you think Hitler was good for Germany? Both you and Admiral Yamamoto were born a year apart in Niigata, and this is true. Grandpa and Admiral Yamamoto, the leader of the Imperial Japanese Navy, were both born in Niigata. But Grandpa was born in Kashiwazaki, and Admiral Yamamoto in I'll think of the name. Slips me right now. Now, he said, did you know him? Grandpa, of course, says no. He's born in Nagaoka. He's born in Nagaoka. I'm born in Kashiwazaki. Okay, so it's 2 o'clock in the morning. Your cousin from Japan arrives in a midget submarine, and he wants you to hide him. What are you going to do? These are tough questions. After questioning Grandpa, Attorney Palmer concluded he wasn't dangerous to the public peace or safety of the United States, and subsequently issued a temporary exemption certificate exempting him from evacuation and from the dusk to dawn curfew. And they established that back in 1942, where Japanese had to be in their house by, I think it was 6 or 7 p.m. all night, or you would get arrested. What did I put up there anyway?
Temporary exemption certificate from the United States Attorney.
Oh, yeah, okay, and that was the first link of his getting exempted. He convinced the United States Attorney that he was loyal to the United States. Whatever his answers were, they had to have been good. So good, he got his foot in the door. He was afterwards screened by the FBI, the Office of Naval Intelligence, and the Army's top lawyer of the United States, Provost Marshal General Alan Guillaume. These are some fat cats.